Hey everyone, this is Eben, and today I'm going to be walking you through a recent portrait study I did of my friend Seraphina, who's actually a model in New York City. You can check out some of her work in a link I've included below the video here, but she was kind enough to let me use one of her photos as a reference here, and so I'm going to walk you through a bit of my process for creating a sort of realistic looking but still sort of digitized style digital painting of a portrait. And so this is obviously played at a faster speed. This is at about 400% speed. So this whole process took me about 2 hours, but I've condensed it down to a half hour here. So let's just talk a little bit about what's happening in this first part. I kind of just am running through it here, but basically I've just put down some random circles of color that sort of loosely matched the background of the photo, and I've taken those strokes and given them a Gaussian blur to kind of match the sort of, out of focus depth of field effect that you can see in the photo. And a little quick thing I did there was I also created a outer glow on a lot of those shapes with a sort of a deep blue tint, and that was just something I was seeing in the reference photo that I wasn't quite capturing with the strokes alone, and that's the result of the skylight sort of filtering through and around the edges of these distant objects. So I'm actually painting on that layer with the outer glow effect still enabled, so everything I paint on has that subtle blue shift towards the edges. And I'm not really too concerned about what these strokes look like when I put them down, because as you see here, I've obviously just blurred them more. I'm really just trying to get a sort of loose approximation of the color, and especially the mood and the tone of the background here, because that's going to really help us contrast with the sharpness and the warmness of the figure in the foreground. So the next step that I'm going to jump into here is mapping out the general shapes of the figure. And when I start out, I like to use the polygonal lasso tool because it sort of helps me be a bit more geometric about plotting out both the positive and the negative space. It sort of simplifies the process for me instead of trying to draw out all the complex edges at first. I just want to make sure that I'm filling the space correctly, that I'm getting some color down, and that I'm not making any significant proportional or compositional errors, at the beginning of the piece. So when I go into the detailing phase, I'm not going to run into those issues and have to backtrack it all or have to adjust what I've already put down. So next thing I'm doing, I'm just taking one of these textured brushes. This is probably the softest and most digital looking brush I have. These are all from the ESA brush pack, which you can find also in the link below the video here. And this one's great for just putting down some nice soft color with a bit of stroke direction in it. So when you make a stroke, there's some lines in there, so you can use it to sort of sculpt 3D forms fairly effectively. And I'm just looking at my reference photo, and I'm trying to find the purest expression of whatever color I see there. And also I'm trying to push that a little bit. So if you've seen any of my other videos, or if you've heard me talk about this before, I'm always trying to push the colors from my reference photo, or just generally in my work, a little further than they otherwise might be. So if I see something that looks a little bit more red relative to the rest of it, kind of like what you see on the side of the arm there, or the oranges around the shoulder. I'm going to take that color slider and I'm going to push it even further in that direction. And that doesn't mean that I'm sort of ramping up my colors by too much throughout the whole piece. I am selective about it, and there are some areas where I'm not going to want to have as much saturation, especially areas that aren't directly related or involved with the focal area, or areas where light is hitting. But for the most part, I am looking for color variations in the reference photo and trying to push those even further, just to really develop the character and the essence of what I'm seeing here. And at this point, I'm not focusing on any of the details of the face. I really want to make sure I get all these general shapes and the lighting and the mood down first before I jump into any of that. Obviously, the face is the most important part here. It doesn't have to be in a portrait, by the way. It generally is, because that's just sort of how our brains work, but I've seen a lot of great artists create beautiful portraits where the face or the eyes are not necessarily the focal point. So that's a choice you can make at any point, depending upon how you want the piece to go and what you find interesting about your reference photo. So you'll see here I'm also using the selection tool to keep some nice crisp edges, and in some case I'm continuing to create those very rigid polygonal shapes that are sort of inorganic and make the whole painting look a bit more digital, but I've actually grown to kind of like that look a little bit, and I find that having those simple straight lines in a lot of my shapes, especially when contrasted with softer areas or curved lines, can really create a lot of interest in a piece, and I think actually is one of the real benefits of working in the digital medium. With traditional oils, it's really hard to get those crisp lines unless you are working with masking tape or something like that, but here it's very quick and easy to make those selections and just work within them to create some texture and really create some solid, clean lines. So there was one thing about this piece that I really wanted to get right, and it was something I saw in the photo that sort of what attracted me in the first place. Was there's this variable light happening, and you can see that in the area around the shoulder on the right side, and below it there's a sort of an area of shadow on the arm, but it's a very soft shadow. It's probably a shadow being cast by an object that's very far away, or something that's not really casting a clean cutoff point for that shadow. So but it works really well for the photograph because it's an area where you don't want there to be a lot of high contrast. Just having those muted sort of dull, low contrast tones on that arm is really helping everything else on this piece to pop. So I'm seeing that, and I'm trying to push it further. I introduced some more grays into that area and some more deep sort of cool reds, as opposed to the brighter, warmer reds and oranges that I'm using around the face and around the neck there. So these are definitely things to look out for and to think about pushing in your piece. You know, when you do a study, you don't have to sort of follow exactly the information that you're being given by the reference photo. You can notice certain trends and push them or pull them back in whatever way is going to work for the design of your piece. So another thing I'd like to point out here is that I'm zoomed out, and I'm also zoomed out in my reference photo, which is on the other monitor. And this is something that's really important for me to do early on in the piece, and perhaps even throughout. Especially, my computer monitor is about I don't know, 1.5 to 2 feet away from my face, and that occupies a pretty large part of my visual field, and the temptation is to fill that whole space with the canvas because you want to take advantage of the resolution or the that kind of thing, which is great for detail work. But at this point in the painting, there's really no need for me to be zoomed in any further than this, and doing so would only really inhibit my ability to clearly see the shapes and colors that I'm putting down, and to accurately assess how well this is stacking up compared with the reference photo. So I'm really only thinking about big shapes, big color movements right now, and not much else. Another thing I'm really liking about this portrait at this point is there's a very nice balance of sort of soft and hard edges that I sort of naturally played up as I put down more hard edges. And that's one way of developing that relationship, is simply by leaving some areas underdeveloped or still in like the sort of underpainting stage, and then moving on to create more detail, contrast, and specificity in other areas. And this creates just a beautiful dynamic. For example, you can see in the shadow of the jawline where it meets the hair, and the top of the shirt there, and the back of the hair, that's all just kind of one blended shape. It all has a very soft edge. There's no detail there. There's no separation between those different objects. I'm just keeping it really simple. I'm including a bit of reflected light variation with that sort of dark deep red, because there is reflected light coming off of the chest and hitting the underside of the jaw there. But other than that, I could have just left this as it was. As you'll see later, I did decide to develop that area a little more and add some hair texture and stuff like that, but that was just a choice I decided to make. Definitely not one I particularly needed to. Another general tip on creating skin tone as well is, I feel like this is one thing a lot of beginner artists miss when creating skin tone. They kind of will sort of look at the shapes of the light hitting the skin and not pay attention so much as to where the light is transitioning to the shadow. And that's a really, really important area when it comes to skin, because skin is slightly transparent and it does absorb some of that light, and the light scatters underneath the skin, which is an effect called subsurface scattering. And this is particularly clear when the light, as I said, is transitioning from light to shadow. You can see it there, or if sort of like what's happening on the chest, on the upper part of the chest, the light is hitting the surface at a slight angle, which means that it's the light is sort of passing through the skin at an angle and passing underneath and sort of glowing from within. And because the light is passing through those blood vessels, and blood is red, the light will shine out as this reddish glow. And so you can see that where I've done that on the edges of the arms, where they sort of, as they turn away from the light, they become a very deep orange or red. And you can also see that, as I mentioned, at the top of the chest there. And anywhere where a shadowed area is transitioning to the light, sort of like on the underneath the shirt there on the left side of the stomach, that's one area that's also catching some reflected light too, which is why it has that nice orange glow there. These are all opportunities to apply that principle and give your skin a really nice lifelike glow to it, and really make the person look alive. Because if you don't, they tend to look a little bit corpse-like. So here I am about halfway through this painting, and I'm just starting to go into the details of the face. And I want to be really careful about this, and because a trap I fall into all the time, and something that I'm sure a lot of people do when they're first starting out making portraits like this, is you'll start to just focus in on very specific details of the features without thinking about the overall shapes first, the positioning of everything, and without sort of suspending the fact that they are facial features. So for example, in that left eye there, I did not make a eye shape. What I was seeing was just sort of the general shadow that was being cast over that area from the brow line. So instead of just diving in and starting to create the eyelashes and the iris and everything, I just lassoed a quick shape there and just filled that in with the approximate color that I was seeing. And I'm taking a different strategy with the eye on the other side because it's being directly lit, which means there's not a lot of room for that kind of loose expression. It really means you have to sort of get all of the proportions and the angles and the folds right, and that can take quite a bit of tweaking and manipulation, and it can get a little tedious sometimes. It's a little different if you are not trying to create a specific likeness. For example, I could have just stopped tweaking right here if I wanted this to just look like a person. But I was trying to create a more specific likeness of the model in the photo. So I did spend a bit of time, especially getting that one eye right, making sure it was the right size, making sure it was at the right angle, that it was the right distance from the bridge of the nose. These are all features that the human eye is super sensitive to. And also flipping the canvas, as I've done here, is one of the best ways to check that, because chances are if you spent 5 minutes working on the details of the face and you flip the canvas, it's going to look pretty horrendous. Or at least, unless you're very experienced, and if you are, props to you, if you can flip the canvas after that and see a human face looking back at you, you're lucky. But a lot of times it becomes very easy to get used to the orientation you're looking at, and you'll sort of miss certain proportional things or details that are making your face look kind of out of whack. So another thing I'm doing throughout this process, which is a nice shortcut for this, is you can just select an area. I just copy and paste it and just move it around a little bit. There's really, honestly, I get so used to doing that, I don't even really bother blending it out afterwards. Sometimes it does leave sort of a hard digital line around there, but I usually end up painting over it anyway, so I'm rarely too worried about that. And as I've said, sometimes I do like to see that kind of digital look and those hard, very hard, clean edges that you get from working in the digital medium. So I think at this point I was sort of drawing a blank. I couldn't quite figure out what to do with this eye and how to, what I needed to do to get it to match the reference photo, because I was just sort of focusing in on it too much. So a strategy I have for dealing with that problem is just moving to a different part of the face or a different area and working on that for a bit and then coming back to it. I actually did end up taking a 15-minute break at some point around this time as well, which is definitely a great way to get some perspective on a piece. And what I did end up finding was that it was in fact the eye's relation to the other features that was sort of throwing me off, and so I did have to go in and develop some of those other features and get those right, the mouth and the nose and all that, before I could... This is a really funny thing that happened there. I accidentally pasted her mouth over her eye, and there was a little weird moment there. I'm glad I caught that on the camera here. But yeah, so sometimes going and working on those other areas for a little bit will help you get some context and sort of help you resolve whatever it is you're trying to figure out in another area. Sometimes it can be something like even the shape of the whole face. You might have the proper relationship between, for example, the eye, the nose, and the mouth, but maybe the space between the eye and the ear or the cheekbone is off, or maybe the shape of the jaw. I mean, these are all really minute tweaks that can really make them the person look very different from your reference photo. And in this case, like, I remember getting to this point and thinking, like, you know, this is a great looking portrait, and I think it looks good. If you didn't know who this was, you wouldn't really worry about it. But again, I was just trying to nail that likeness. I was really trying to get all of these features in the right place and capture the character and the essence of the model here. So that's something, again, that you can decide for yourself. If you are just wanting to figure out how to make a face that looks like a nice face, you probably can stop sooner than this, you know. Think how loosely you work with your references definitely varies from person to person, and even, you know, a lot of great professional artists do use their references quite loosely, and will sort of, like I said, push things and really just kind of use them as a jumping off point, which is not particularly what I did here. I really, as I said, wanted to get the likeness down. So I was experimenting with some of the highlights there around the face, and another thing you want to be careful with there is because I've established a focal area around the eyes, particularly that one eye that's facing the light. I want to create the highest level of contrast around that area, and I don't want to create too much competing contrast or brightness in other areas of the face or other areas of the photo. So you may notice me here and there dialing up highlights in other areas because that's what I see in the reference photo, but then I might just walk them back a bit because it's not something I want to develop from a design standpoint. And the other thing I was thinking about here is, like, I was seriously debating whether or not I wanted to develop this eye that's in shadow. And I think there was a point in this painting where I actually could have really justifiably left that area sort of blank and unspecified, as I did with the hair and the shadow of the face that I was talking about earlier. But in the reference photo, the lighting doesn't quite work that way, and maybe if the light source was a bit closer to or angled so it hit the side of the face more than the front, it might have been feasible to leave it that way, but it didn't quite work with the lighting source because half of that eye, actually most of that eye, is actually fully lit. So the shadow only really extends to the top of the eyelid. So with that in mind, I decided I might as well just sort of paint it out and get detailed there. So that's what I did. But with that in mind, what I was trying to do with this this other eye was to sort of deliberately dull it down. I didn't use quite the same level of contrast there. I don't think I even used the same value for the shadows. I think I lightened it up a little bit, and I sort of I even took the white down a little bit of the eye, so it's not quite as bright as it is in the other eye. And this was a deliberate choice I made to sort of make that eye into a secondary focal point as opposed to a primary focal point, which is the main eye on the other side. So these are, choices and decisions I'm making throughout this process. With any study, these are things to be thinking about. Where do you want your main point of focus to be, and what are some other points of interest, and how do you want them to be organized hierarchically? Because having a bunch of really equally interesting areas around your photo is not gonna, or around your painting, is not going to lend well to a pleasant viewing experience, just because it sort of creates a conflict in the viewer, and they don't really know where to start, where to go, and it's sort of it creates this tension. Whereas if I just develop one area, make it really interesting, make it really contrasty, and sort of take everything else down a little bit, it's really going to make this whole piece much more easier to look at. So even now, as that I'm working on the details of the face, I'm still not zooming in that much. I'm going in further than I was before, and if there's ever a point where I just need to zoom in just because my hand is going to cramp up if I try to make those details or those line strokes at the scale, I will do that. But I want to keep an eye on the navigator, and I don't stay zoomed in for very long. I'll sort of, from this perspective, I'll make a mental note of the stroke that I need to make at that scale, and I'll zoom in, I will make that stroke, and then I'll pop right back out. Because again, from that scale, it can really distort your perception of how everything is looking from a distance and how all the proportions are working together. So this is another great brush that I have in the brush pack, the rough comb brush. This is a really great application for it, is just creating some nice loose textured hair, and I sort of alternate between putting down a sort of deep red base color where the sunlight is sort of filtering underneath and glowing from within, and then on top of that putting a more directly illuminated highlight color. And you don't want to go straight from the shadow tone, which is mostly colorless, or at the very least pretty muted and dark, to the highlight color. It's really going to sort of deprive the texture of life. And the hair, just like the skin, does allow light in. It does sort of can glow from within given the right circumstances. So that's really important to be aware of as well. And there was a nice thing that I neglected to do earlier, was I sort of blew up the hair a lot more than I had meant to, and that was actually sort of cutting down that shape, and to match the reference photo actually solved a lot of the proportional problems I was seeing. So even something as simple as that, like how is the shape of the hair framing the face, even if you have all of the facial features proportionally working, sometimes that can throw off the whole impression. Another thing I've implemented a little bit here, which you will usually see in any portrait, or if you don't, it's something you can decide to push yourself, is the general local color zones of the face. For example, in the cheeks, I've included a lot more warm pinkish, reddish hues, as opposed to the forehead and the sides of the mouth and the chin, which are more of a yellow. And or in men, if there's some kind of stubble, that can be a bit more blue. So if you're ever working on a portrait, these are good things. Oh, and around the nose as well, and the sides of the nose, that tends to be a lot more relatively red as well. So that's something you can always push to give the skin a bit more warmth, a bit more life. And that's something I've done here just a little bit. And finally, I'm just finishing up with a little from my spatter brush here, which is great for just creating some quick skin variation and skin texture on top of the sort of very smooth digital brush strokes. It can really help your skin texture and realism factor pop quite a bit. And then one of the last things I'm doing here is sort of a strategy I use for a lot of direct light pieces, is I've made a selection. I go to select, and then I make a color selection. I select the brightest highlights, I copy and paste them onto a new layer, and then create an outer glow effect on linear dodge mode to give them, to even reinforce that subsurface scattering and glow quite a bit more. So I know that was a lot of information, but that's it for this tutorial. And so I appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you've enjoyed this or found it informative or helpful in some way in your own art. And so please like the video and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. It would help me out quite a bit. And please leave a comment letting me know what you think, if you want to see more content like this, or if you have a request for content from this channel in the future. Alright, that's it for me today. Take care, guys.